March of 1242. On the soaked plains of Hungary, an army that had shattered kingdoms from China to the gates of Europe was moving in the wrong direction, eastward, away from victory. The Mongols, feared, disciplined, undefeated, were retreating. Only months earlier, they had annihilated the Hungarian army in one of the bloodiest defeats medieval Europe had ever witnessed. Cities burned. Nobility vanished. Entire regions lay silent. And ahead of them, almost unbelievably, the road to Western Europe stood open. Vienna was within reach. Beyond it lay Germany, Italy, France. Wealth, manpower, and power unlike anything the Mongols had yet encountered. By every strategic measure, this was the moment empires are made. And yet they turned back. For more than 800 years, historians, chroniclers, and classrooms have offered a simple explanation. The Great Khan died. The invasion stopped. Case closed. It is a neat answer. Comfortable. Easy to remember. But history, as it so often does, resists simplicity. Because when you look closely, the story begins to unravel. The timing doesn't quite fit. The decisions don't fully align. And the behavior of the men leading the greatest military machine the world had ever seen raises uncomfortable questions. Why would commanders who had never hesitated before suddenly abandon an entire continent? Why retreat when momentum, fear, and opportunity were all on their side? This is not just a story about Mongols and medieval Europe. It is a story about power at its limits. About decisions made under uncertainty. About how forces beyond human control, political, environmental, and strategic, can converge to alter the course of history. And it begins with one of the most haunting questions Europe has ever asked. Why did the unstoppable army turn back? To understand why the Mongol withdrawal from Europe was so extraordinary, we first need to understand what the Mongol Empire actually was at the moment it appeared on the world stage. In 1206, on the windswept grasslands of Central Asia, a man named Temujin achieved something no one before him had managed to do. He united the fiercely independent Mongol tribes, groups that had spent generations fighting, raiding, and betraying one another, under a single authority. When he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler, it was not an empty title. It marked the birth of a new kind of power. Genghis Khan did not build his empire through brute force alone. His true revolution was organizational. He broke tribal loyalties and reorganized society around merit, discipline, and loyalty to the state rather than bloodlines. Commanders were promoted for ability, not ancestry. Soldiers were grouped into units that mixed tribes together, making rebellion far more difficult. Laws were standardized. Intelligence networks were formalized. In an age when most armies still relied on feudal obligation and seasonal service, Genghis created a professional war machine that could move, adapt, and strike with astonishing speed. By the time of his death in 1227, the Mongol Empire already stretched from northern China deep into Central Asia. But the foundations he laid allowed it to expand even further after him. His third son, Ogidi, inherited the title of Great Khan. Ogidi was not the visionary his father had been, but he possessed something equally important, the ability to recognize talent and empower it. Under his rule, the Mongol state became more centralized, more bureaucratic, and even more capable of sustaining long-distance campaigns. Roads were improved, supply depots established, and communication systems refined. The empire was no longer just conquering, it was learning how to govern conquest. At the heart of this expansion stood one man above all others, Subutai. If Genghis Khan created the Mongol system, Subutai perfected its use. Born the son of a blacksmith, Subutai rose entirely on merit, becoming the greatest military strategist of the medieval world. He did not merely win battles, he designed campaigns on a continental scale. Subutai thought in terms of geography, logistics, psychology, and timing. He coordinated armies separated by hundreds of miles, using messengers, prearranged signals, and precise schedules that allowed Mongol forces to converge exactly when and where they were needed. The Mongol military system itself was unlike anything Europe had ever faced. These were not slow-moving feudal levies burdened by armor and supply trains. Mongol armies were almost entirely mounted. Each warrior typically traveled with several horses, rotating mounts to avoid exhaustion. This allowed Mongol forces to cover 60 to 100 miles a day, 3 times the speed of most European armies. Their bows, compact and powerful, could penetrate armor at distance. Their tactics emphasized mobility, deception, and coordination. Feigned retreats, sudden encirclements, and psychological warfare were not occasional tricks. They were standard operating procedure. Equally important was the Mongol approach to intelligence. Long before an invasion began, scouts mapped terrain, studied weather patterns, identified political divisions, and gathered information about roads, rivers, and fortifications. Enemy weaknesses were catalogued. Potential allies were noted. When the Mongols finally moved, it was rarely into the unknown. Their enemies, by contrast, often had little understanding of who they were facing. By the 1230s, the Mongol Empire was no longer content with regional dominance. Under Ogdi's rule, the strategic horizon expanded dramatically. Subutai proposed an audacious idea, a full-scale invasion of Europe. Not a raid. Not a punitive expedition. A conquest. The plan envisioned multiple armies advancing simultaneously across vast distances, overwhelming resistance before European powers could coordinate a response. From the steppes of Russia to the heart of the continent, the goal was nothing less than reaching what Mongol sources described as the Great Sea, the Atlantic Ocean. This is a crucial point that is often misunderstood. The Mongol campaign in Europe was not accidental, nor was it merely opportunistic plundering. It was deliberate, planned, and strategic. Europe was seen as the next logical extension of imperial expansion. The same methods that had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, shattered the Rus principalities, and subdued northern China would now be applied westward. From the Mongol perspective, Europe was fragmented, politically divided, and militarily outdated. Kingdoms competed with one another. Nobles resisted centralized authority. Armies relied on heavily armored knights whose strength lay in shock combat, not flexibility. Siege warfare was inconsistent, and coordination between states was rare. To Subutai and his contemporaries, Europe appeared vulnerable, rich in resources, yet poorly prepared for a modern, mobile war. By the time Mongol armies crossed into Eastern Europe in the late 1230s, they did so with supreme confidence. This was not arrogance, it was experience. They had faced larger populations, stronger fortifications, and harsher environments before, and they had prevailed. The campaign that followed would confirm their expectations again and again, culminating in the devastation of Hungary and the terror that spread across the continent. This background matters because it reveals just how extraordinary the events of 1242 truly were. When the Mongols advanced into Europe, they did so as the most effective military force on Earth, led by commanders who had never known strategic failure, supported by a system designed for relentless expansion. Nothing in their history suggested hesitation. Nothing in their doctrine favored retreat. And nothing in Europe at first glance appeared capable of stopping them. That is why their decision to turn back demands explanation. To understand that decision, we must first appreciate what the Mongols were, how they fought, and what they believed was possible. Only then can we grasp why, at the very height of their power, the greatest war machine of the medieval world chose to walk away from an open continent. Hungary was not chosen by chance. In the eyes of Mongol planners, it was the hinge on which Europe turned. Geographically, the Hungarian plain was a natural corridor, a vast open landscape remarkably similar to the Eurasian steppe. For a cavalry-based army, it was ideal terrain, flat, open, and capable of sustaining large numbers of horses. Strategically, Hungary guarded the eastern approaches to Central and Western Europe. Break Hungary and the road to Vienna, Germany, and beyond lay open. There was also a political justification. Tens of thousands of Cumans, a nomadic people who had once been subjects of the Mongols, had fled west and taken refuge under the protection of the Hungarian king. To the Mongols, this was both an insult and a provocation. Hungary was not just a target of opportunity. It was a target that needed to be crushed. What followed was a campaign designed with chilling precision. Subutai did not advance with a single army. He orchestrated multiple offensives across hundreds of miles, ensuring that no European power could respond in a coordinated way. One Mongol force moved into Poland, another into Transylvania, while the main army advanced directly into Hungary. This was not merely an invasion, it was a demonstration of control. Each column supported the others by spreading fear, confusion, and paralysis. European rulers could not tell where the real blow would fall, only that destruction followed wherever the Mongols appeared. The campaign in Poland was never intended to conquer the region outright. It was a diversion, brilliant, ruthless, and devastating. In April 1241, near the town of Legnica, a coalition of Polish forces, Moravian troops, and German knights gathered under Duke Henry II. They represented some of the best heavy cavalry Europe could field. To medieval observers, this army embodied the ideals of knightly warfare: armored nobles, disciplined ranks, banners snapping in the wind. Against them stood Mongol horse archers, lightly armored, fluid, and terrifyingly calm. The battle unfolded with textbook Mongol tactics. Feigned retreats drew the European cavalry out of formation. Smoke and confusion fractured command and control. Once the knights were separated and disoriented, Mongol units closed in from multiple directions. What followed was slaughter. Duke Henry was killed, his army annihilated. The Mongols displayed his severed head on a spear, parading it before the walls of nearby cities. The message was unmistakable: resistance brought annihilation. The Polish campaign had done its job. European attention was pulled north, while the true catastrophe unfolded elsewhere. That catastrophe came in Hungary. In March 1241, Mongol forces entered the kingdom from several directions at once. King Bela IV attempted to respond, but the speed of the Mongol advance overwhelmed every effort at coordination. Hungarian defenses were swept aside with alarming ease. By early April, the decisive confrontation loomed near the Sejo River, close to the village of Mohi. On paper, the Hungarians appeared strong. Their army may have numbered as many as 80,000 men, perhaps more. They outnumbered the Mongols and believed that sheer mass would compensate for lack of experience. Bela was confident, perhaps too confident. He assumed the Mongols would attempt a frontal crossing of the river and prepared accordingly. When the first Mongol assault was repelled by crossbow fire during the night, the Hungarian camp erupted in celebration. Guards were relaxed. Discipline faded. The army believed it had held its ground. What the Hungarians did not see was Subutai at work. While the main Mongol force fixed their attention at the bridge, Subutai led a large detachment southward through the darkness. They found a ford, crossed the river, and constructed a temporary bridge. By dawn, Mongol forces stood behind the Hungarian army. The trap was complete. The Battle of Mohi was not simply a defeat. It was a demonstration of annihilation. Mongol catapults hurled incendiary projectiles into the Hungarian camp, spreading fire and panic. Smoke filled the air. Horses screamed. Soldiers trampled one another in their attempts to escape. When Bela realized the army was being surrounded, he ordered a retreat into the camp itself, a fatal decision. The camp had been poorly designed, cramped, and boxed in by wagons that restricted movement. To the Mongols watching from nearby hills, the scene was painfully clear. The enemy had penned itself like livestock. Then came one of Subutai's most devastating maneuvers. He deliberately opened a gap in the encirclement. It was an illusion of mercy. Bela fled through it, believing escape was possible. The rest of the army followed, abandoning formation, discipline, and weapons in their panic. At that moment, Mongol cavalry surged in from all sides. Exhausted, unarmored, and trapped in open terrain, the Hungarian soldiers were cut down in vast numbers. Contemporary witnesses described the roads choked with bodies, the rivers running red. Tens of thousands died in a single day. The kingdom's military leadership was virtually wiped out. After Mohi, organized resistance collapsed. What followed was not a campaign of conquest in the conventional sense, but systematic devastation. Mongol forces moved through Hungary with near-total freedom. Towns were destroyed. Villages burned. Fields were laid waste. The population was terrorized into submission or slaughtered outright. In some regions, a quarter to half of all inhabitants perished within a year. This was one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the Middle Ages, and its psychological impact echoed far beyond Hungary's borders. Fear spread across Europe like wildfire. To contemporaries, the Mongols seemed less human than apocalyptic. Rumors portrayed them as demons, cannibals, servants of biblical destruction. Rational preparation gave way to panic and prayer. European rulers appealed for help, but coordination was minimal and slow. No unified defense emerged. It appeared that nothing stood between the Mongols and the heart of Western Europe. And yet, amid this devastation, something remarkable happened. The Mongol advance slowed. Despite total victory on the battlefield, despite the collapse of Hungary as a functioning state, the invasion did not accelerate westward as expected. Vienna still stood. Germany remained untouched. The army that had crushed everything in its path now paused, its momentum strangely broken. At this moment Hungary lay shattered. Its king was a fugitive. Its people were dead, displaced, or starving. Its institutions had collapsed. By any traditional measure, the kingdom was finished. And for centuries, this devastation became part of a larger story told by others. A story in which Europe was saved not by its own actions, but by forces far away and beyond its control. But as we will see, the catastrophe of Hungary was not the end of the story. It was the turning point. The moment when the limits of even the most powerful war machine in history began to emerge, quietly and unexpectedly, amid mud, fire, and human ruin. By the winter of 1241, fear had settled over Europe like a long, dark shadow. News traveled slowly in the Middle Ages, but when it came, it carried images too horrifying to ignore. Entire armies wiped out in a single day. Cities reduced to ashes. Populations erased. To people who had never seen an enemy move faster than a marching column, the Mongols appeared almost supernatural. They seemed to arrive without warning and vanish just as suddenly, leaving only silence behind them. In marketplaces, monasteries, and royal courts, the same question was whispered again and again. Who or what could stop them? This fear was magnified by imagination and belief. Medieval Europe interpreted catastrophe through a religious lens. The Mongols were not merely foreign invaders, they were fitted into a cosmic narrative of good and evil. Chroniclers linked them to Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic forces described in the Bible, destined to be unleashed at the end of days. Even the name by which they were known fed this dread. Tatars became Tartars, echoing Tartarus, the pit of hell in classical and Christian thought. In sermons and letters, the Mongols were described as godless monsters, immune to mercy, driven by forces beyond human understanding. Reality mattered less than meaning, and meaning demanded a villain worthy of the fear they inspired. Yet beneath the myths lay an uncomfortable truth. Europe was unprepared. Its kingdoms were divided by rivalry, suspicion, and ambition. Kings guarded their borders but rarely coordinated beyond them. When appeals for help arrived from the east, they were met with delay, hesitation, or indifference. The Holy Roman Emperor had his own conflicts. The kings of France and England were absorbed in their rivalries. The papacy called for unity even for a crusade, but enthusiasm was limited and organization nearly non-existent. No single authority could compel a collective response. In the face of a unified, mobile enemy, Europe remained fragmented. As the Mongols crossed the frozen Danube in the winter of 1241, the last natural barrier between them and Western Europe fell away. Scouts probed deep into Austria and Moravia. Vienna itself was within reach. Panic intensified. Refugees fled west. Rumors outran facts. In many places, prayer replaced preparation. And then, almost as suddenly as it had risen, the storm seemed to break. News began to circulate that the Mongols were withdrawing. At first, few believed it. Then confirmation arrived. The armies were moving east. For contemporaries, this reversal demanded explanation, and the explanation that emerged was simple, dramatic, and deeply comforting. The great Khan Ogedai had died. Ogedai's death in December 1241 was real and significant. As the son of Genghis Khan and ruler of the empire, he was the keystone of Mongol authority. According to Mongol custom, when a great Khan died, all princes of the royal family were required to return to the capital for a kurultai, a council to elect the next ruler. Without a great Khan, the empire risked fragmentation, even civil war. To European observers, this law seemed to offer a clear cause and effect relationship. The leader died. The army turned back. Europe was spared. Over time, this explanation hardened into accepted truth. Chroniclers recorded it. Preachers repeated it. Later historians taught it. It fit neatly into a worldview shaped by providence. God, it was said, had intervened. He had struck down the Mongol ruler at the critical moment to protect Christendom. Giovanni de Pien del Carpine, a Franciscan friar sent to the Mongol court a few years later, would echo this belief, suggesting that divine will, not human action, had saved Europe. In an age desperate for reassurance, the story provided comfort. Europe had not been defeated, it had been rescued. The appeal of this explanation is easy to understand. It assigns meaning to chaos. It transforms terror into testimony of faith. It reduces an overwhelming, complex crisis into a single, graspable event. One death. One decision. One turning point. For centuries that was enough. But simplicity often conceals more than it reveals. Even at the time, cracks appeared in the story. News did not travel at the speed of modern communication. A message from Karakorum to Hungary would take months, even under ideal conditions. Yet the Mongol retreat began in the spring of 1242, long before confirmation of Ogedai's death could have reliably reached all commanders in the field. More puzzling still, not all Mongol leaders responded as tradition demanded. Bata Khan, the commander of the European campaign, did not rush back to the capital. In fact, he never went at all. For medieval Europeans, these details were largely invisible or irrelevant. What mattered was that the threat had receded. The explanation, once accepted, was rarely questioned. Over generations, it became a historical reflex, repeated without scrutiny. Textbooks simplified it. Lectures summarized it. The death of OGDI became the answer to a question few paused to examine more closely. This pattern should feel familiar. Human beings, especially in moments of crisis, crave clear narratives. We prefer single causes to tangled systems, decisive moments to slow, cumulative pressures. For leaders, merchants, and ordinary people alike, the idea that Europe had been saved by one event was far more satisfying than the notion that survival had been contingent, fragile, and incomplete. Yet the more we learn, the more this traditional explanation begins to feel inadequate. Empires do not abandon open continents lightly. Professional armies do not reverse course based on rumor alone. And commanders who had defied distance, climate, and resistance across half the known world were unlikely to abandon their greatest opportunity without weighing many factors. The story Europe told itself after 1242 was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth. It was a story shaped by fear, faith, and relief. A story that made sense emotionally even if it failed analytically. To understand what really happened, we must move beyond the comfort of that simple explanation and examine the forces that were invisible to medieval chroniclers but unmistakable to modern eyes. Because the Mongols did not retreat merely because a ruler died. They retreated because the world they were trying to conquer had begun, quietly and relentlessly, to push back in ways no one fully understood at the time. For generations the story felt settled. The Mongols turned back because their emperor died. It was neat, dramatic, and morally satisfying. But when modern historians began to examine the retreat of 1242 with the same rigor we apply to business failures, military campaigns, or economic collapses, the old explanation began to crack. The deeper scholars looked, the clearer it became that history had been simplified not because the truth was obvious, but because it was inconveniently complex. The first fracture appears in the timeline itself. OGDI Khan died in December of 1241, thousands of miles away in Mongolia. Even by Mongol standards of communication, fast riders, relay stations, disciplined messengers, news of that magnitude could not have reached the armies in Hungary for months. Yet archaeological evidence and written records suggest the withdrawal from central Hungary was already underway by early spring of 1242. Armies do not reverse strategic direction on rumors. Commanders do not abandon open territory on unconfirmed news. The timing simply does not align. Then there is Batu Khan. As the supreme commander of the Western campaign and a grandson of Genghis Khan, Batu had every political reason to return east if succession was truly the decisive issue. He did not. He remained on the Volga, consolidating his power and laying the foundations of what would become the Golden Horde. This was not the behavior of a man compelled by tradition to drop everything and rush to Karakorum. It was the behavior of a strategist making calculated decisions, weighing opportunity against risk. To understand those risks, we must look not at thrones and councils, but at the ground beneath the horse's hooves. In the past 2 decades, climate historians have added a powerful new tool to the study of medieval warfare: dendrochronology or tree-ring data. By analyzing growth patterns in ancient trees, scientists can reconstruct yearly climate conditions with remarkable precision. When researchers applied this method to Eastern Europe in the early 1240s, a striking picture emerged. The Hungarian plain, which had initially offered ideal conditions for Mongol warfare, flat terrain and open pasture, underwent a sudden climatic shift. After a relatively dry period, the winter of 1241 to 1242 was followed by unusually heavy snowfall and persistent spring rains. Rivers overflowed. Lowlands turned into marshes. What had once been a cavalry highway became a logistical nightmare. For an army built on speed, maneuver, and mounted archery, mud was not an inconvenience. It was a strategic threat. The Mongol military system depended on horses to a degree unmatched by any European force. Each warrior maintained several mounts, rotating them to preserve stamina. These horses required constant grazing. They could not survive on stored fodder for long periods, especially in large numbers. Wet conditions reduced grass growth and made movement exhausting. Horses slipped, fell, and fatigued more quickly. Supply lines, already stretched across thousands of miles, became fragile. The very environment that had enabled Mongol dominance began to resist it. Logistics, often invisible in heroic narratives, now moved to center stage. Feeding tens of thousands of men was difficult. Feeding hundreds of thousands of horses bordered on impossible. Unlike European armies, the Mongols did not carry extensive supply trains. Their strength lay in self-sufficiency and mobility. When the land failed to provide, that strength evaporated. Campaigning deeper into Western Europe would have meant pushing into even more forested, river-crossed, and fortified terrain. precisely the opposite of what Mongol doctrine favored. At the same time, resistance within Hungary was changing. The initial invasion had shattered the field army and devastated open settlements, but it had also taught painful lessons. Stone castles, once dismissed as irrelevant by Mongol commanders accustomed to wooden fortifications and open cities, began to matter. Hungary, Austria, and neighboring regions were dotted with strongholds that could not be easily bypassed or destroyed. Each castle forced a choice: invest time and resources in a siege or leave a hostile force at your rear. Local resistance also adapted. Small bands harassed supply routes, attacked isolated units, and denied the Mongols the psychological dominance they had relied upon. This was not heroic resistance in the romantic sense. It was pragmatic, persistent, and costly to suppress. For the Mongols, accustomed to decisive battles and rapid collapse, this grinding form of warfare offered diminishing returns. Vienna represented the ultimate test of these limits. The city stood behind strong defenses, protected by rivers and walls, with supply lines that favored the defenders. A prolonged siege would have been unavoidable. Such an operation required time, stable logistics, and favorable terrain, none of which were guaranteed in the spring of 1242. To press forward would have meant gambling the core of the army on conditions increasingly outside Mongol control. Bata Khan, faced with these realities, did what effective leaders have always done. He reassessed. The objective was not glory at any cost, but sustainable expansion. Europe was no longer presenting itself as an open door. It was becoming a series of bottlenecks, attritional struggles, and environmental obstacles. Retreat in this context was not defeat. It was strategic withdrawal. Seen this way, the Mongol retreat ceases to be a mystery or a miracle. It becomes a case study in limits, of logistics, of climate, of adaptability. Ogdi's death mattered, but not as a single, decisive cause. It mattered because it added political uncertainty at the very moment when environmental and military pressures were already mounting. It tipped the balance rather than dictating the outcome. The old story endured because it was easy. The real story endures because it is instructive. It reminds us that even the most powerful systems depend on conditions beyond their control, and that success often masks fragility until the environment changes. The Mongols did not fail to conquer Europe because they were suddenly weak. They stopped because the world they encountered was no longer compatible with the way they fought, moved, and survived. And in that realization, history shifts from legend to lesson. By the time the Mongol armies turned their horses eastward in 1242, the question Europe would ask for centuries had already taken shape. What stopped them? The temptation has always been to search for a single secret, a hidden lever pulled at the decisive moment. But history, like leadership and enterprise, rarely turns on one factor alone. It turns when pressures converge. And in the case of the Mongol withdrawal from Europe, the real answer lies not in a dramatic revelation, but in the quiet accumulation of constraints that reshaped what victory meant. There was no single cause. There was no sudden loss of nerve, no mystical intervention, no forgotten trick. What unfolded was a convergence of political uncertainty, environmental resistance, military economics, and strategic calculation, each manageable on its own, but together decisive. Politically, the Mongol world was entering a period of instability. Ogdi's death did not issue an automatic recall order, but it changed the calculus of risk. Power in the Mongol Empire was never abstract. It was personal, negotiated, and fiercely contested. Bata Khan was not merely a general. He was a political actor with rivals, allies, and ambitions of his own. Continuing a deep European campaign meant operating far from the center of power at a moment when succession was unresolved. Every mile west increased the danger that decisions made in his absence could shape an empire he intended to influence. Even for a system as disciplined as the Mongols, uncertainty at the top altered priorities on the ground. At the same time, the environment was asserting itself in ways no commander could ignore. The Mongols had mastered geography as few armies ever had, but they had not conquered nature itself. The transformation of the Hungarian plains from open pasture to waterlogged terrain was not symbolic. It was operational. Horses tired faster. Mobility declined. Communication slowed. These were not problems that courage or skill could solve. They were structural limits imposed by climate. For a military machine built on speed and flexibility, losing those advantages meant becoming something it was never designed to be. Military cost began to outweigh military reward. Up to that point, Mongol campaigns had followed a brutal but efficient logic. Decisive battles shattered enemy forces. Cities fell quickly or not at all. Resistance collapsed early, and the survivors submitted. Europe, by contrast, was proving resistant in a different way. Castles multiplied. Rivers and forests fragmented movement. Each advance demanded more time, more manpower, and more logistical improvisation. The further west the army moved, the less decisive victory appeared to be. This is a concept modern leaders understand intuitively. Not every opportunity is worth pursuing indefinitely. At some point, growth becomes expensive. Returns diminish. Risk compounds. The Mongols were not chasing symbolic conquest. They were building a sustainable empire. If Europe required a fundamental change in how they fought, long sieges, slow advances, seasonal pauses, it ceased to be a favorable theater of expansion. Strategy then came into focus. The Mongols had already achieved significant objectives. Eastern Europe had been devastated. Hungary's military power was broken. The message of Mongol supremacy had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. From the perspective of deterrence and dominance, the campaign had succeeded. Pushing further into Western Europe offered uncertain gains at rising cost. Holding the territories already conquered, consolidating power on the Volga, and stabilizing internal politics promised greater long-term advantage. The decision to withdraw was therefore not an admission of weakness, but an expression of strength. It required discipline to stop. It required perspective to recognize when the conditions that once favored expansion no longer applied. Fear did not drive the retreat. Calculation did. This reframing matters because it restores agency to the historical actors involved. Europe was not saved by accident, nor was it spared by benevolence. It survived because a powerful empire encountered limits, and because those limits aligned at a critical moment. Climate, terrain, resistance, logistics, and politics combined to alter the balance. Remove any one of them and the outcome might have been different. Together they made further conquest unattractive. In this sense, the Mongol retreat from Europe becomes a case study not in mystery, but in decision-making under complexity. It illustrates how even the most formidable systems respond rationally to changing conditions. Success does not guarantee permanence. Dominance does not eliminate constraint. And expansion, when pursued without reassessment, can undermine the very strength that made it possible. For centuries, Europe told itself a comforting story, that it had been spared by a single stroke of fate. The truth is more demanding but also more instructive. Europe stood at the edge of collapse, and it survived not because the Mongols faltered blindly, but because the world they encountered refused to bend indefinitely. There was no secret that halted the Mongol invasion of Europe. There was a convergence of forces that redefined what victory looked like. And in that convergence lies the real lesson history offers. One as relevant to modern leaders as it was to medieval commanders riding across the plains of Hungary. History rarely ends with a clean moral, but it often leaves us with a mirror. The Mongol retreat from Europe reminds us that no power, no matter how disciplined, innovative, or feared, is ever truly invincible. Strength exists within conditions, and when those conditions change, even the mightiest forces must adapt or withdraw. What saved Europe was not a miracle, but a convergence of preparation, resilience, geography, and time. Societies that endured were those that learned quickly, rebuilt intelligently, and refused to disappear quietly. There is another lesson here, one especially relevant today. Progress is not linear, and dominance is never permanent. Whether in business, leadership, or creative work, success depends on understanding the environment you operate in as much as mastering your own strengths. Ignore the terrain, economic, social, or cultural, and even the best strategy can fail. History is not a collection of simple answers. It is a layered conversation between human ambition and the world that resists it. If this story made you rethink what you thought you knew about the Mongols or about how history actually works, take a moment to join the conversation. Leave a comment with your thoughts or the lesson that stood out to you. And if you value deeper, more thoughtful explorations of the past, stories that go beyond the textbook and speak to the present, subscribe to the channel. Because history doesn't just explain where we came from. It helps us understand how to move forward.